The government is lying to you about inflation, but it's not what you think. Inflation is actually a lot lower than the government is telling us. No, wait. Don't thumb me down just yet. I've got the math and the data to back this up. The statistics that the government is reporting about the rent in cities across America are way off base, and after all last year understating the rent to make it look like inflation was lower than it actually is, this year they're doing the opposite. They're overstating the rent, and the rental increases are actually a lot lower than they're reporting, and rent is the single biggest contributor to the consumer price index, which they just reported this morning at 4.0%. Now, this data right here, this is taken right out of the CPI report from this morning, and I have highlighted the index for shelter. This number all the way on the side here, that 8.0, that is the 8% increase in the overall index for shelter that the government just reported. Now, the index for shelter makes up 1/3 of the entire consumer price index math. So the CPI is more sensitive to moves up or down in rent than any other data point in the entire calculation. And within the shelter index for rent is something called owner's equivalent rent. And if you've been following this channel, you know all about how I just hate this statistic, owner's equivalent rent. And if you're not familiar, this is pretty much how the government collects that data. Time to measure inflation. Yellow. Hi, this is the government calling. Oh, good. Tell me, how much would you rent your house for, furnished, without utilities? But my house isn't even for rent. Don't care. Well, I can't just give you a number off the top of my head. I'd have to look at what the comps in my area are renting for. I'd have to take into account taxes and maintenance costs.
There's no time! I must have your answer now!
Okay, then how about just my mortgage payment plus $200? Okay, thanks. See you, bye. Well, wasn't he nice? Asshole. Now, remain calm, folks. That was just a reenactment. Don't worry, it was fiction, and my Keynesian evil twin couldn't even hold a government job, so it wasn't really all that realistic. But the way the data is collected, that's pretty much how it works. And that's why this little excerpt from the CPI report this morning is so important. The index for all items less food and energy, otherwise known as core inflation, rose 5.3% over the last 12 months. The shelter index increased 8.0% over the last year, accounting for over 60% of the total increase in all items less food and energy. That means out of all 5.3% core inflation that was just reported, somewhere around 3.2% of that was just the increase in rent. Now feast your eyes on this magnificent chart here. This is a chart of the year-over-year change in owner's equivalent rent going back the last 4 years. You can see it's been steadily rising, and only these last few months, it started to level off. Now, I want to zero in on two specific data points, February of last year and this most recent data point. In February of last year, the government told us that the rent, the owner's equivalent rent, had only risen by 4.3%. 4.3% in February of 2022, and now this year they're telling us that the increase was 8%. So according to the government statistics, the rent is on the rise, even though it's leveled off the last month or two. This shows a pretty sustained uptrend in owner's equivalent rent. Now let's step back from the realm of bogus, totally made up on the spot government statistics, and let's look at what the real world is telling us about what happened to the rent over the same exact time period. This chart is the year-over-year change in the median asking rent as observed by Redfin.com, one of the biggest real estate websites in the US. And just look at the difference in this chart. Now keep in mind, this chart is showing a rate of change. So even though the trend is coming down, any positive number means prices are still going up. It just means they're going up slower. But look at that most recent data point, negative 0.6. According to Redfin, the median asking rent in the United States has actually taken a slight tick down over the last month. But owner's equivalent rent is telling us it's at an all-time high, up 8%. What gives? But now take a look at this point right here, February of 2022, 17.5%. Remember, the owner's equivalent rent statistic from the CPI math told us that back then the rent was only going up 4.3%, when according to Redfin, they saw an increase of 17.5%. So what does this mean? This means that last year in February, The CPI math should have been way, way higher, that they were lying to us about inflation because the statistic is so flawed. It was making inflation look like it was much lower than it really is, but now it's doing the opposite. Now it's showing that the rent is not rising anymore, and maybe even falling a little bit, but the CPI is telling us it's rising faster than ever. Okay, I can tell you're still not convinced. You don't like the Redfin data? Let's look at Zillow's data. Check this one out. This was just released a few days ago, and this data is up until May of 2023. Look right next to me down here in blue. The Zillow Observed Rent Index says that the rent has gone up 4.8% over the last year. Well, CPI is telling us it's been 8.0%, when Zillow, whose business is real estate, is telling us 4.8%. Now, that's much higher than the Redfin number, but it's still way below what the government is telling us. And once again, we get a similar chart pattern. Check out the February of 2022 data. Back in February of 2022, Zillow was telling us 17.0% increase in the rent, back when the government was telling us 4.3%. So take all this information together. The government is telling us 4% inflation, 5.3% core inflation, but 60% of that 5.3% core inflation is all due to owner's equivalent rent. Now, let's say we take the average of the Zillow and the Redfin data and we compare that with owner's equivalent rent. Even when we use the average, owner's equivalent rent is overstated by a factor of almost 4. And remember, that's 60% of the contribution to inflation. So if we were to swap out owner's equivalent rent for the average of Zillow and Redfin, which according to any sane, reasonable person is a far more accurate reflection of what you can actually rent a place for, well, now the CPI goes from somewhere around 4.0% to something closer to 2.4 or 2.5%. And last year in February, when they were telling us CPI was something like 7.9%, it was really closer to 14 or 15%. Again, the government is lying to you about inflation. They lied to you last year. They told you it was lower than it really was. And they're lying to us this year, except they're telling us it's a lot higher than it actually is. Now, this is not meant in any way to belittle the financial hardship that last year's lies about inflation have inflicted on the average person. But keep in mind, the Federal Reserve and all these government agencies are making massive financial decisions based on a fundamentally flawed data point that does not reflect the boots on the ground reality that most people are living with. And if you consider how high inflation should have been last year, how low it should be right now, connect the dots in that trend line, then the chart would tell you what I've been telling you for a long time now on this channel. Inflation is falling, and it's falling fast. It's going to keep falling. It's going to fall below the Fed's 2% target. It's going to fall below zero. It's going to fall into negative territory, and we are going to have a deflationary recession on our hands. And the numbers in the rent are already starting to show that. Till next time, live small and dream big.